Welcome to my channel Static Doctrine. Before we begin, tell us your location, your city, your country, and the current time there. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and like this video. It supports our channel's growth and helps preserve these powerful narratives. Remain with us until the very conclusion, because what you are about to hear is among the most audacious uprisings in early American history. Relax, eliminate distractions, and listen carefully as we venture into the shadows. In the winter of 1811, along the Mississippi River just outside New Orleans, the air was heavy with more than just a cold wind. It was thick with tension. Sugar plantations lined the riverbanks. Enslaved men and women endured brutal conditions, cutting cane from dawn to dusk. Sugar was regarded as one of the most punishing forms of labor in the South. The work was grueling. The consequences for slowing down were harsh. Whips cracked across backs. Families were torn apart. Lives were measured in profit margins. Among those living in bondage was Charles Deslondes. He was no ordinary field hand. He served as a driver on the plantation of Colonel Manuel Andre. A driver was an enslaved man placed in a supervisory role over other enslaved workers. He was expected to enforce discipline, report on behavior, and keep order. It was a perilous role. Drivers were resented by some for appearing to side with the master. Yet they too remained enslaved and were subject to punishment without mercy. Deslondes existed in a complex space between authority and subjugation. Charles Deslondes was of mixed heritage and likely knew multiple languages spoken in Louisiana at the time, including French and Creole. This gave him access to information. He could travel between plantations more freely than others. He could converse with various groups, and as he moved, he paid attention. He heard stories of the Haitian Revolution, where the enslaved had risen and overcome French forces. He listened to the growing frustration among those forced to harvest sugar under intolerable conditions. He recognized opportunity in their anger. The plan forming in his mind was not small. It was not merely an act of personal vengeance. It was a full-scale insurrection. The objective was to march down the German coast, toward New Orleans, gather in hundreds along the way, seizing weapons, and ending slavery in the region. It was daring. It was perilous. It demanded coordination across plantations. Yet, in early January of 1811, Deslondes decided the moment had arrived. On the night of January 8, 1811, the revolt commenced. Under cover of darkness, Deslondes and a group of enslaved men entered the Andre plantation house. They were armed with axes, cane knives, and farming tools. Manuel Andre was wounded in the attack. His son, Gilbert Andre, was killed. The house was set ablaze. Flames rose into the frigid night sky. The rebellion had begun. The killing of Gilbert Andre was a direct blow against plantation authority. It signaled that this was no minor disturbance. It was warfare. As the fire burned, the rebels moved swiftly from plantation to plantation. They enlisted others, sometimes through force, sometimes through persuasion. Within hours, their ranks swelled. Estimates suggest between 200 and 500 enslaved men joined the march. It became the largest slave uprising in United States history. They advanced toward New Orleans in military formation. Witnesses later described drums beating and men moving in orderly lines. Some carried flags. Others bore captured firearms, though many still held only farm tools. Their goal was unmistakable: reach New Orleans, seize control, and dismantle the system that bound them. It was an extraordinary vision born in fields of suffering. But the white planter class responded swiftly. News of the revolt spread rapidly along the river. Militia units were mobilized. Planters armed themselves. Territorial Governor William Claiborne called for troops. Within days, armed forces confronted the rebels. A violent clash occurred near what is now Deslondes. Gunfire echoed across the cane fields. Many rebels fell in battle. Others fled into the swamps. Charles Deslondes initially escaped. He hid in the marshlands, hoping perhaps to regroup or vanish, but he was captured soon after. What followed was brutally harsh. He was not afforded a fair trial. He was not shown mercy. Accounts from that period report that he was tortured severely. His hands were severed. He was shot. His body was burned. The punishment was intended to send a stark message. It was meant to extinguish hope. After suppressing the revolt, authorities executed dozens of captured rebels. Their heads were placed on spikes along the Mississippi River as a warning to others. For miles, travelers could see the remains displayed publicly. The message was unmistakable: rebellion would be met with terror. Yet fear can silence voices temporarily, not permanently. The German Coast Uprising did not achieve its objective. Slavery persisted in Louisiana for decades afterward. But the magnitude of the revolt shook the region profoundly. Plantation owners realized how close they had come to losing authority. The memory of 1811 lingered long after the smoke cleared. Laws became stricter. Patrols increased. Communication between enslaved people was monitored more closely. Charles Deslondes did not survive to see freedom arrive in Louisiana, yet his actions place him among the most daring leaders of early American resistance. He did not act solely out of anger. He organized. He coordinated. He believed that unity could overcome fear. The killing of Gilbert Andre was not random violence. It was a calculated strike against a system founded on forced labor and cruelty. As you envision that march down the river road, imagine the sound of boots and drums, the glow of burning plantations behind them, the cold air carrying both hope and peril. Imagine knowing that failure meant death, yet pressing forward anyway. That is the weight of this story. Charles Deslondes resides in the static doctrine, not because he was insignificant, but because his story is often eclipsed by later revolts. Yet in 1811, long before the Civil War, he led the largest uprising the young United States had ever witnessed. His courage compelled Louisiana to confront the reality that slavery was never secure. It was always vulnerable to those it sought to silence. Thank you for remaining with Static Doctrine. Tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there now. If this story opened your eyes, subscribe and like so more hidden histories can emerge from the shadows. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, sometimes the mightiest systems crumble not from external invasion, but from the bravery of those forced to live within them. Part 2. The morning after flames rose from the Andre plantation, panic spread along the Mississippi River. Faster than the winter wind, plantation owners rode hard on horseback, shouting warnings to neighbors. Church bells rang alarms. Rumors swelled with each retelling. Some said hundreds were marching. Others claimed thousands. Fear does not await confirmation. It multiplies in uncertainty. What white planters grasped immediately was this: the enslaved had organized and had struck first. Colonel Manuel Andra, wounded but alive, wasted no time. Despite his injuries, he rode to alert other planters and militia leaders. His son Gilbert lay dead, a symbol of how serious the uprising had become. This was not a minor skirmish. This was not a handful of men escaping into the woods. This was an armed march downriver toward New Orleans, the territory's most vital city. If the rebels reached it and acquired more weapons, the consequences would be unthinkable for the slaveholding class. Governor William Claiborne received word promptly. Louisiana had only recently been incorporated into the United States. Stability was precarious. The Haitian Revolution remained fresh in memory. The prospect of a similar uprising near New Orleans terrified officials. Claiborne ordered militia units to mobilize at once. Planters formed armed patrols. Some even joined forces with United States troops stationed nearby. The response was rapid because the fear ran deep. Meanwhile, Charles Deslondes and his expanding force continued their march. As they moved from plantation to plantation, they recruited more men. Some joined willingly, inspired by the promise of freedom. Others were compelled to join for survival. Estimates from the period suggest their numbers reached between 200 and 500. They wielded axes, cane knives, clubs, and a few firearms taken from plantation houses. Though not heavily armed, they had numbers and resolve. Witnesses later described the rebels marching in orderly lines. Drums beat to maintain rhythm. Some men wore pieces of military-style clothing taken from plantations. The sound of feet on frozen ground resonated along the river road. Smoke from burning homes trailed behind them. The rebels were not moving aimlessly. Their path was clear. They were heading toward New Orleans. The sight of enslaved men marching openly in formation challenged the entire structure of Southern society. Slavery relied on the belief that enslaved people were scattered, isolated, and powerless. Here they were, unified and advancing. For a fleeting moment, power shifted. Planters fled their homes. Families hid valuables. Mothers clutched children tightly. The fear that enslaved people endured daily had reversed direction. The first major confrontation occurred near the plantation of Jacques-Fortier. Armed militia met the rebels in open ground. Gunfire shattered the early morning silence. The rebels fought back with whatever weapons they held. Cane knives flashed. Muskets fired. Chaos engulfed the fields. Many rebels fell under gunfire. Others scattered into nearby swamps and forests. Charles Deslondes was not captured in that initial clash. He managed to escape into the wetlands. For 2 days, militia groups hunted the remaining rebels. Dogs were used to track footprints. Armed patrols searched through marsh and brush. One by one, captured men were brought back in chains. The system had regained physical control, but it had been shaken. When Deslondes was finally discovered hiding in the swamps, the authorities chose not to grant him even the semblance of a formal trial. His punishment was immediate and brutal. Historical accounts describe torture meant to serve as a deterrent. His hands were severed. He was shot multiple times. His body was burned. The violence inflicted on him reflected the fear he had inspired. They wanted no hero to rise from this story. They wanted terror to replace hope. The captured rebels faced military tribunals. Trials were swift and severe. Dozens were sentenced to death. Executions took place publicly. The severed heads of the executed were mounted on wooden poles along the Mississippi River. For miles, travelers could see the grim display. It was meant to convey a message to every enslaved person in Louisiana. Rebellion would lead to unimaginable suffering. Yet history teaches us something important. Public terror does not erase memory, it deepens it. Enslaved communities remembered what had happened in January 1811. They remembered the scale of the march. They remembered that hundreds had dared to act together. Even in defeat, the uprising proved that unity was achievable. White planters responded by tightening laws. Patrols increased. Restrictions on movement became stricter. Meetings between enslaved people were monitored closely. Communication across plantations was limited whenever possible. The German Coast Uprising altered how Louisiana's slaveholders governed. They no longer believed control was automatic. They understood it required constant enforcement. The revolt also influenced broader Southern policy. News of the uprising traveled beyond Louisiana. Planters in Mississippi and Alabama discussed it in private meetings. The Haitian Revolution had already demonstrated what could happen on a large scale. Now, Louisiana had experienced its own near catastrophe. The fear of coordinated slave rebellion became a permanent fixture in Southern political thought. Charles Deslondes did not survive to tell his own story. His voice was silenced violently. Most of what we know comes from records written by those who opposed him. Yet even in those hostile accounts, a picture emerges of strategic planning and bold leadership. He understood geography. He understood communication networks among plantations. He understood that timing mattered. The winter harvest season meant many men were concentrated in fields and could move together. Though the revolt failed to overthrow slavery, it remains the largest slave uprising in United States history. That fact alone demands attention. In 1811, decades before the Civil War, hundreds of enslaved men marched openly toward freedom. They challenged one of the wealthiest plantation regions in the country. They forced the government to respond with military force. As you reflect on this chapter of static doctrine, picture the river road at dawn, smoke drifting across frozen fields, drums echoing against cane stalks, militia riders racing toward confrontation. Picture Charles Deslondes standing at the head of that march, knowing that capture meant death, yet pressing forward anyway. That is the weight of courage. Stay with us for the next part as we examine the long-term impact of the German Coast Uprising, how it shaped Louisiana's future, and how the memory of Charles Deslondes continued to live in whispers long after the poles along the river were removed. Long after the heads were taken down from the poles along the Mississippi River. Long after the blood had dried in the cane fields, the German coast still carried a tension that could not be erased. Plantation life resumed on the surface. Sugar production continued. Boats loaded barrels onto the river as they always had. But something fundamental had shifted. The illusion of complete control was shattered. White planters had witnessed organized resistance firsthand. They had experienced the terror of losing everything in a single night. That fear would shape Louisiana for generations. In the immediate aftermath of the uprising, lawmakers moved quickly. Patrol systems were expanded. Enslaved people were required to carry written passes more strictly than before. Gatherings were restricted. The objective was straightforward: prevent communication. Slaveholders believed that the power of the revolt stemmed from coordination across plantations. If enslaved men could not meet, could not speak freely, could not travel between properties, then another uprising might be stopped before it began. But systems built on silence rarely achieve total success. People find ways to communicate even under surveillance. The sugar plantations of Louisiana were among the harshest in North America. The labor required to cut and process cane demanded long hours and relentless speed. Injury was common. Exhaustion was constant. Overseers enforced production with violence. In such conditions, anger was not rare. What made 1811 different was not anger alone, but organization. Charles Deslondes had transformed scattered frustration into collective action. That transformation is what frightened planters most. For enslaved communities, the memory of the uprising did not fade. Stories were whispered at night in cabins. Elders spoke cautiously about the march toward New Orleans. They described the drums, the burning houses, the brief moment when hundreds moved as one. They also spoke about the consequences: the torture of Deslondes, the executions, the public display of heads. These details were not forgotten. They served as both warning and inspiration. Resistance carried risk, but silence carried suffering. Across the South, other enslaved people heard of the revolt. News traveled slowly, carried by sailors, traders, and word of mouth. In places like Mississippi and Alabama, planters discussed the German Coast Uprising in private meetings. They strengthened militias. They purchased more weapons. The specter of Haiti remained a haunting memory. And now Louisiana added its own example. Slaveholders understood that their system rested on a population that outnumbered them in many regions. That imbalance required constant vigilance. Years passed, but the pattern of resistance continued. In 1822, Denmark Visai would plan an uprising in Charleston. In 1831, Nat Turner would lead a revolt in Virginia. Each event was distinct, shaped by local conditions and leadership. Yet they shared a common thread: the conviction that slavery could be challenged directly. The German Coast Uprising stands as one of the earliest large-scale manifestations of that conviction in the United States. Historians studying the revolt often examine the unique context of Louisiana. The territory had a complex cultural mix of French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean influences. Many enslaved people spoke French or Creole. Some had knowledge of military tactics from revolutions in the Caribbean. Charles Dons himself may have been shaped by these broader Atlantic movements. The Haitian Revolution had concluded only a few years earlier. Its success proved that enslaved people could defeat colonial armies. That example resonated deeply. Modern scholars also analyze how fear shaped historical records. Much of what we know about the uprising comes from accounts written by white officials. These reports sometimes exaggerate numbers or emphasize violence to justify harsh punishment. At the same time, they reveal the extent of panic. Words like insurrection and massacre appear frequently. Such language reflects the shock experienced by the planter class. Today, historical markers stand in parts of Louisiana acknowledging the uprising. Museums include exhibits about Charles Dons and the German Coast March. For many years, the story was eclipsed by later events in American history. Yet recent scholarship has brought it back into focus. It reminds us that large-scale resistance did not begin in the Civil War era. It existed decades earlier, organized and resolute. When visitors stand near the Mississippi River and envision the events of January 1811, it can be difficult to picture such a massive march along what now appears as a tranquil landscape. Modern roads and houses have replaced many plantations, but beneath the surface lies history. Hundreds once moved down that same path with weapons in hand and hope in their hearts. The river witnessed both their bravery and their defeat. Charles Dons remains a figure of both inspiration and tragedy. He did not survive to witness any change. His death was brutal and calculated. Yet the attempt he led proved that enslaved people were not passive laborers awaiting rescue. They were thinkers, planners, and fighters willing to risk everything. The killing of Gilbert Andre was not random chaos. It was a declaration that the plantation system could be confronted directly. As you continue this journey with my channel's static doctrine, consider the weight of organizing under constant threat. Imagine coordinating across plantations without telephones, without written messages that could be safely exchanged. Imagine trusting that hundreds would rise at the same moment. That level of unity requires belief. It requires courage that surpasses individual anger. The German Coast Uprising did not destroy slavery in Louisiana, but it carved a deep mark into its history. It revealed vulnerability where planters claimed strength. It exposed the cost of oppression not only to the enslaved, but to the society that relied on fear to maintain order. And it left behind a legacy that echoes through every later struggle for freedom. Stay with us as we move into the next part of this powerful story, where we will explore how the memory of Charles Deslondes challenges modern audiences and why his shadow still stands along the Mississippi River more than 2 centuries later. More than 2 centuries have passed since the cold night of January in 1811. Yet the shadow of Charles Deslondes still stretches along the Mississippi River. The landscape has changed. Highways now traverse where dirt paths once carried marching feet. Modern houses stand where plantation homes once burned. Sugar cane still grows in parts of Louisiana. But the labor that once defined the region has transformed. Yet history does not vanish simply because landscapes evolve. It settles beneath the surface, waiting for those willing to examine closely. For many years, the German Coast Uprising received scant attention in textbooks. It was mentioned briefly, sometimes reduced to a paragraph. The focus of American history often centered on the Civil War, leaving earlier resistance in the shadows. But scholars began to revisit archival records. They re-examined military reports, trial documents, and letters written by planters. With careful analysis, they pieced together a fuller picture of what had occurred. They recognized that the scale of the uprising warranted more than a footnote. It required acknowledgement as the largest slave revolt in United States history. Public memory began to shift. Historical markers were placed in Satine, John the Baptist Parish, and surrounding areas. Museums developed exhibits explaining the revolt's significance. Community groups organized educational programs. These efforts were not just about honoring the past. They were about confronting uncomfortable truths. The uprising forced recognition that slavery in Louisiana was not a quiet system maintained without resistance. It was contested terrain. Modern visitors who walk near the river often struggle to picture the sound of drums echoing through cane fields. Yet when historians describe the march toward New Orleans, the image becomes vivid: hundreds of men moving in formation, armed with farm tools and captured weapons. Smoke rising behind them, fear ahead of them, hope within them. The rebellion was not random chaos. It was structured movement aimed at a clear objective. That level of organization challenges stereotypes about enslaved people lacking coordination or strategic thinking. Charles Deslondes himself remains a complex figure. Records do not provide his full biography. We do not know the precise details of his early life. We do know he held a position of trust as a driver. We know he communicated across plantations. We know he led an attack that resulted in the death of Gilbert Andre. And we know he endured horrific punishment upon capture. From these fragments, a portrait emerges of a man who understood both the brutality of slavery and the potential for collective action. In recent years, conversations about historical memory have intensified across the United States. Communities debate how to remember figures connected to violence and oppression. Within those discussions, the story of Charles Deslondes presents a powerful example of resistance rather than dominance. His revolt was directed against a system built on forced labor and dehumanization, yet acknowledging that resistance also requires confronting the violence involved. History rarely offers tidy narratives. It offers human complexity. Educators now use the German Coast Uprising to illustrate how early America was shaped not only by founding fathers and political leaders, but also by enslaved people who challenged injustice directly. Students learn that resistance did not begin with the Civil War. It existed from the moment slavery took root. Understanding this changes perspective. It reveals that the fight for freedom has always included those denied official power. The uprising also highlights the influence of the broader Atlantic world. Louisiana's connection to Caribbean revolutions shaped the thinking of enslaved communities. The success of Haiti demonstrated that plantation systems could collapse under organized revolt. That knowledge traveled through sailors, traders, and oral communication. Charles Deslondes operated within that context. His vision of marching toward New Orleans reflected awareness of larger revolutionary currents. When we consider the brutality of his execution, we must also consider what it reveals about fear. Torture is not merely punishment. It is spectacle. It is designed to convey a message. The authorities wanted to ensure that no one would view Deslondes as heroic. They sought to replace admiration with terror. Yet history shows that such displays often fail in the long term. Memory reshapes events. Courage can survive even when bodies do not. Standing on the banks of the Mississippi today, it is possible to imagine the quiet before the uprising. The still air, the dark river reflecting faint light, the moment before movement begins. Then envision the sudden change, the attack on the Andre Plantation, the fatal blow to Gilbert Andre, the march down river. That contrast between calm and eruption captures the essence of the event. Oppression may appear stable, but beneath it, pressure accumulates. When it releases, it can reshape history. Charles Deslondes did not attain the freedom he sought. Slavery in Louisiana continued for more than half a century after his death, but his attempt forms part of the larger arc that eventually led to emancipation. Each act of resistance added weight to the moral and political struggle. Each uprising forced slaveholders to confront vulnerability. The German Coast Uprising stands as a reminder that freedom's history includes both triumph and sacrifice. As we close this powerful chapter in Static Doctrine, take a moment to reflect on what this story reveals. It reveals the strength of organized resistance. It reveals the fear hidden within systems of power. It reveals the cost of courage. Charles Deslondes marched knowing that failure meant death. Yet he marched. That choice echoes across centuries. Tell us where you are watching from, your city and country, and what time it is there now. If this story deepened your understanding of early American resistance, subscribe and like so we can continue uncovering powerful histories that deserve to be remembered. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember that along the quiet banks of the Mississippi River, the shadow of Charles Deslondes still walks, reminding us that freedom has always required brave souls willing to rise. More than 200 years have passed since the night Charles Deslondes stepped into the Andre Plantation house and changed the course of Louisiana history. Yet the weight of that moment still hangs over the Mississippi River. Time has softened the landscape, but not the meaning. Where cane fields once stretched endlessly under watchful overseers, there are now roads, towns, and modern industries. People drive past, sane. John the Baptist Parish, without always knowing what unfolded there in the winter of 1811. But beneath the surface of ordinary life lies a story that refuses to fade. To understand the true legacy of Charles Deslondes, we must step back into that frozen January once more and look not only at what happened, but at what it exposed. Slavery in Louisiana was brutal, even by Southern standards. Sugar production demanded speed and endurance. The cutting season was short, intense, and unforgiving. Workers labored from before sunrise until darkness fell. Injuries were common. Punishments were severe. The system relied on fear to maintain order. Yet the revolt exposed a truth slaveholders tried to deny. Fear works both ways. When Deslondes and his men struck, they shattered the illusion that plantations were secure fortresses. They demonstrated that enslaved people were not simply enduring their condition. They were thinking, planning, communicating, and waiting. That realization changed how slaveholders perceived the world around them. After 1811, Louisiana planters lived with chronic anxiety. They armed themselves more heavily. They expanded patrol systems. They enforced restrictions with renewed severity. The rebellion may have been crushed, but its psychological impact lingered. The public execution of captured rebels was meant to extinguish hope. Heads placed on poles along the river were intended to terrify anyone considering resistance. Travelers reported seeing the grim display stretching for miles. It was a spectacle of power. Yet history teaches us that such displays often have unintended consequences. They confirm the very fear they attempt to suppress. If rebellion were impossible, such brutality would not have been necessary. For enslaved communities, the memory of that march toward New Orleans became part of oral history. Parents spoke carefully to children about what had happened. They described the drums that echoed across fields. They spoke of houses burning in the distance. They spoke of courage and loss. These stories were not recorded in official documents. They survived in whispers and quiet instruction. In that way, the uprising lived on. Decades later, when other revolts emerged in different states, the pattern became clearer. Denmark V's planned uprising in 1822, Nat Turner's revolt in 1831. Each had its own context and leadership, yet they shared a foundation laid by earlier acts of resistance. The German Coast Uprising stood as one of the earliest and largest examples. It proved that organized rebellion on a massive scale was possible within the United States. Modern historians have examined the revolt through many lenses. Some analyze the economic pressures of sugar production. Others focus on the influence of the Haitian Revolution. Still others study the role of drivers like Deslondes, who occupied complex positions within plantation hierarchies. What emerges from these studies is a portrait of calculated defiance rather than spontaneous rage. Don did not act impulsively. He built networks, identified timing, understood geography. His leadership was deliberate. In recent years, public awareness of the uprising has grown. Historical markers stand in Louisiana, acknowledging the events of January 1811. Museums include exhibits detailing the march and its aftermath. Scholars publish research bringing attention to the scale of the revolt. This renewed focus challenges earlier narratives that minimized enslaved resistance. It reminds audiences that American history is not shaped solely by presidents and generals, but also by those forced into chains who refuse to accept them quietly. Standing along the Mississippi today, one can imagine the river carrying more than trade and commerce. It carried fear in 1811. It carried the sound of drums. It carried the smoke of burning plantation homes. It carried the realization that the enslaved population outnumbered those who claimed ownership over them. That imbalance was always present, but rarely confronted so openly. Charles Dons remains a figure wrapped in both courage and tragedy. His death was brutal, intended to erase his influence, yet his influence endured. He demonstrated that leadership could emerge from within the oppressed. He showed that unity could form across plantations. He proved that the plantation system was not immune to coordinated challenge, even in failure. His revolt forced Louisiana and the broader South to recognize vulnerability. As we reflect on this final chapter of his story, we must consider the broader lesson: oppression may appear strong, but it often rests on unstable ground. It depends on silence, isolation, and in clear's throat fear. When communication breaks isolation, when courage overcomes fear, stability can crumble quickly. The German Coast Uprising did not bring immediate freedom, but it carved a path of resistance that others would follow. History is not a straight line. It bends through moments of courage and consequence. Charles Dons marched knowing that capture meant death, yet he moved forward anyway. That choice echoes across time. It challenges us to ask what courage looks like in our own era. It reminds us that freedom has always required risk. As you sit listening to this story, imagine the sound of those drums once more. Imagine the cold air of January. Imagine the glow of flames against the dark sky. Imagine the determination in the eyes of men who chose action over submission. That image is not meant to glorify violence. It is meant to honor resolve. It is meant to acknowledge that resistance has always been part of the American story. Charles Dons does not have grand statues in every town square. His name is not always spoken in classrooms, but along the Mississippi River, his shadow remains. It walks beside the cane fields. It moves with the current of the water. It whispers that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit can rise. Thank you for staying with Static Doctrine through every chapter of this powerful journey. Tell us again where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is there now. If this story opened your eyes and deepened your understanding, subscribe and like so that more hidden histories can rise from the shadows. Stay curious, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the greatest revolutions begin in the quiet before the storm. Chapter 6. When we step beyond the smoke of burning plantation houses and the violence that followed the German Coast Uprising, we begin to see something even more powerful than the clash itself. We begin to see how memory survives. The authorities believed that by killing Charles Deslondes in such a brutal manner, they would erase him. They believed that by lining the Mississippi River with severed heads, they would crush every thought of rebellion. But history shows us again and again that terror may silence voices for a moment, yet it rarely silences memory. In the years after 1811, the sugar plantations of Louisiana continued to expand. The demand for sugar grew stronger across the young United States. More enslaved people were transported into the region through the internal slave trade. Families were forced from Virginia and the Carolinas down to Louisiana to work in fields, where the labor was harsher and the life expectancy shorter. The system grew larger, yet beneath that growth was insecurity. Planters had witnessed how quickly order could break. They had seen hundreds march toward New Orleans in organized formation. That image could not be forgotten. Every winter during harvest season, tension returned. Overseers watched more closely. Patrols doubled their routes. Planters kept weapons loaded inside their homes. The rebellion had lasted only days, but its impact stretched for decades. It changed how slaveholders thought about control. They no longer viewed plantations as peaceful estates. They saw them as potential battlefields. The very land that produced wealth also held the possibility of revolt. Among enslaved communities, the story of Charles Deslondes took on quiet significance. It was not told loudly in public spaces. It was not written in newspapers controlled by white editors. It was passed in fragments. A mention of the march, a reminder of the drums, a warning about betrayal. These fragments carried both inspiration and caution. They reminded listeners that unity was possible, but they also reminded them of the price paid. Courage did not guarantee survival. As the nation moved toward greater division over slavery, Louisiana remained deeply committed to the institution. The state's economy depended heavily on sugar and cotton. Political leaders defended slavery as essential. Yet beneath their confident speeches lingered the memory of 1811. It stood as proof that enslaved people were not content with their condition. They were watching. They were waiting. When the Civil War finally erupted in 1861, Louisiana once again found itself at the center of conflict. New Orleans was captured by Union forces in 1862. The Mississippi River became a strategic target. Enslaved people in Louisiana seized opportunities to escape when Union troops advanced. Some joined the Union Army. Others fled to contraband camps seeking protection. In these moments, the spirit of earlier resistance resurfaced. Though Charles Deslondes had died half a century earlier, his defiance lived on in those who refused to remain in chains when war created new possibilities. After emancipation in 1865, Louisiana entered Reconstruction with both hope and hostility. Freedmen sought education, land, and political participation. Black men voted and held office during Reconstruction governments. Schools were established where literacy had once been forbidden. Churches flourished as centers of community leadership. For a brief period, it seemed that the dream of freedom envisioned by earlier rebels might take root. Yet backlash followed swiftly. White supremacist groups used violence to intimidate black voters. Laws were rewritten to limit political power. By the end of the 19th century, segregation and disenfranchisement hardened across the South. The promises of Reconstruction were pushed aside. Still, even in that restrictive environment, memory endured. The German Coast Uprising became part of a longer chain of resistance, stretching from slavery through segregation and into the civil rights movement. In the 20th century, scholars began to examine events like the uprising of 1811 more closely. For many years, mainstream history had minimized slave revolts. Textbooks often portrayed enslaved people as passive recipients of freedom granted by political leaders. That narrative began to change as researchers reviewed plantation records, court documents, and military reports. They realized that the revolt led by Charles Deslondes was not a minor disturbance. It was a large-scale insurrection that nearly reached New Orleans. Modern historians emphasize that the uprising demonstrates strategic organization. Deslondes chose a moment during harvest season when large numbers of men were already concentrated in fields. He targeted plantation homes first, seeking weapons and disrupting communication. He aimed toward New Orleans, the center of political and economic power. These decisions reveal planning. They reveal intelligence. They reveal a leader who understood both geography and psychology. Today, when people visit Louisiana and learn about the German Coast Uprising, they often express surprise. Many have never heard of Charles Deslondes. They may know about Nat Turner or the Underground Railroad, but not about the largest slave revolt in United States history. Bringing this story into public awareness changes the understanding of American history. It reminds us that resistance did not wait for the Civil War. It was present from the earliest days of the nation. Standing beside the Mississippi River in the present day, one might hear only the hum of modern traffic and the movement of barges. Yet, if you listen closely in imagination, you can almost hear the echo of drums from that January march. You can picture hundreds walking together with hope in their hearts, despite knowing the risk. You can sense the fear that rippled through plantation homes as smoke rose into the sky. Charles Deslondes does not fit neatly into simple categories. He was neither a politician nor a soldier in a formal army. He was an enslaved man who witnessed injustice daily and decided to confront it directly. His revolt did not succeed in ending slavery, but it succeeded in revealing truth. It showed that beneath forced labor lived determination. It showed that unity could form across plantations. It showed that power built on cruelty is never entirely secure. As you reflect on this chapter, consider the broader messages. Systems of oppression often appear stable until they are challenged. The German Coast Uprising was one such challenge. Though crushed, it carved a permanent mark in Louisiana's history. It stands as testimony to the courage of those who refused to accept bondage without resistance. Stay with Static Doctrine as we move into the final chapter of this story, where we will gather the full meaning of Charles Deslondes' life and consider why his shadow continues to matter more than 2 centuries later. More than 200 years have passed since the winter night when Charles Deslondes stepped into the Andre Plantation house and set fire to a system that believed itself untouchable. The cane fields have changed. The plantation houses that once stood in rigid rows along the Mississippi River have been replaced, restored, or erased. The men who ordered executions are long gone, yet the story refuses to disappear. It lingers not because it was victorious, but because it was bold. It lingers because it forces us to confront a truth that history often tries to soften. Slavery in America was never peaceful. It was contested ground from the beginning. When we look carefully at the German Coast Uprising, we see more than violence. We see planning under pressure, communication across barriers designed to isolate. Enslaved people were deliberately separated by language, by plantation boundaries, by constant surveillance. The system relied on that separation. Yet Charles Deslondes moved across those invisible walls. As a driver, he traveled between fields and houses. He observed patterns. He listened. He calculated. His position gave him insight into both the weaknesses and strengths of plantation authority. He used that knowledge to build something dangerous: unity. Unity is what frightened the planter class. More than anything else, one act of resistance by a single person could be punished quickly. But hundreds marching together toward New Orleans represented a shift in power. For a brief moment, those who had always been ordered to obey were giving orders. They were choosing direction. They were setting the pace. That reversal shook the foundation of Louisiana's slave society. Even though the revolt was crushed, the shock waves traveled far. Slaveholders across the South tightened restrictions. Patrols increased. Laws were rewritten. But beneath these measures was anxiety. They had seen what was possible. They understood that enslaved populations often outnumbered white populations in many regions. They knew that if coordination spread beyond one parish, control could unravel rapidly. That fear remained present through every later uprising. After the Civil War ended slavery in 1865, the memory of earlier revolts gained new meaning. During Reconstruction, black communities in Louisiana sought education and political power. For a short time, it seemed as though the dream of self-determination was becoming reality. Though Charles Deslondes did not live to witness it, the freedom he marched toward in 1811 became law more than 50 years later. That connection matters. History does not move only through victories. It moves through persistence. When Reconstruction collapsed and segregation tightened its grip, resistance changed form. It no longer looked like marches with cane knives toward New Orleans. It looked like court challenges, church meetings, and organized boycotts. Yet the spirit remained similar, a refusal to accept injustice quietly. The same determination that moved through Deslondes' march could be seen generations later in those who faced segregation and disenfranchisement with courage. Modern historians continue to uncover details about the uprising. Archaeologists study plantation sites. Researchers compare trial transcripts and militia reports. They examine how rumors and fear shaped white responses. Each new piece of evidence adds depth. It reminds us that the revolt was not a spontaneous riot, but a coordinated insurrection rooted in clear objectives. Deslondes and his followers were not acting blindly. They were acting strategically. Public awareness has grown in recent decades. Museums and historical sites in Louisiana now include information about the German Coast Uprising. Educational programs discuss the scale of the march. Documentaries explore the connection between Louisiana and the broader Atlantic world. These efforts ensure that Charles Deslondes is no longer confined to footnotes. He stands as a central figure in understanding resistance before the Civil War. As we reflect on his life, we must acknowledge both courage and consequence. The revolt led to bloodshed. It ended in torture and execution. It did not free Louisiana's enslaved population. Yet it exposed the fragility of a system built on fear. It demonstrated that control maintained by violence can never be fully secure. It showed that beneath forced silence, voices were organizing. Imagine standing along the Mississippi River at dawn in 1811, the sky pale with winter light, smoke still drifting from burned structures, armed militia moving through fields searching for survivors. In that landscape of tension and fear, something irreversible had occurred. The enslaved had marched openly. They had dared to imagine seizing New Orleans. That imagination alone marked a turning point. Today, when we speak the name Charles Deslondes, we speak of more than one man. We speak of collective action, of early American resistance that predates the Civil War by half a century, of a moment when hundreds chose to risk everything rather than accept a life defined by chains. The story challenges comfortable narratives. It reminds us that American history is layered with struggle. It reminds us that freedom was not handed down gently. It was fought for in fields, in forests, in courtrooms, and on battlefields. Some efforts succeeded quickly, others ended in tragedy, but each contributed to a larger arc bending toward emancipation. As we close this journey in static doctrine, let the image of that march stay with you. Drums echoing along the river road, cane knives glinting in cold light, determination stronger than fear. Charles Don did not live to see freedom come to Louisiana, but his defiance carved a permanent space in history. His shadow still stands along the Mississippi, reminding us that even the harshest systems face those who dare to rise. As we close this powerful chapter in Static Doctrine, take a moment to reflect. A question for you. Was this a rebellion, or was it the first true revolution for freedom in America? Comment below and let me know your thoughts. Tell us where you are watching from, your city and country, and what time it is there now. If this story deepened your understanding of early American resistance, subscribe, and like so more hidden histories can rise from the shadows. Stay curious, stay aware, and remember that history's quietest corners often hold the loudest truths.